these traditional territories, and I acknowledge that I'm a guest on this land. I offer my respect and my gratitude to these ancestral communities whose land was taken from them by force, and to the many Native American people that live here today. Our speaker with us today is none other than our very own Field Museum, Dr. Nigel Pitman. Nigel is a Mellon Senior Conservation Ecologist in the Keller Science Action Center, and he also has 25% of his time in the Integrative Research Center. Nigel is a world-renowned ecologist and conservationist with deep knowledge of South American forests. His research focuses on Amazonian tree ecology, but he also works on the endemic floras of Ecuador and Peru, long-term trends in Amazonian animal abundances and extinction risks in South American plants. He's been working with the museum's rapid inventory team since 2001 and has taken part in 6 inventories. He is an excellent synthesizer, a creative thinker, a gifted writer, and a wildly talented scientist. We're excited to hear his talk today. It has a captivating title, Extinctions in the Mist, testing the hypothesis of a modern mass extinction event among South American plants. Let's give Nigel a warm welcome.
Thanks a lot, Abigail, and thank you everyone for coming. Now, more than deliver a lecture today, what I'd like to do is tell you a story. And it's a story about plant science and plant conservation in coastal Ecuador, but it's also a story about how we do science, the choices we make, mistakes we make, and how decades later that can bring us surprises. And finally, it's a story about myself. It's a story about how I got interested in tropical plant conservation in the first place and what I've done about it over the last 30 years. So the story begins with this guy. And I want to say that any month of the year, but especially Women's History Month, it's unfortunate that we're starting a scientific story by saying, once there was a guy. More on that later. For now, what I want to recognize is that this scientific story begins with a man because it begins at a time in which women were systematically discouraged from doing science. This is Al Gentry, mostly active in the 1970s and 1980s, one of the most admired botanists of his generation. And he was admired because he did it all. Collected more plant specimens from more countries than anyone else. He was a systematist, taxonomist in one of the largest plant families in the tropics. He wrote foundational papers in plant ecology about the distribution, abundance, and diversity of tropical plant communities. He wrote the field guide that I use, that so many people in my generation use to learn how to identify plant species in South America. He did conservation. And among the many things that he did were really detailed floristic inventories of about half a dozen sites in coastal Ecuador. He did this work with a botanist at Selby Botanic Garden, Cal Dodson, and throughout the 70s and 80s, they visited and revisited these sites, collected and recollected, wrote floras and field guides and papers about these sites. And in 1991, they wrote a paper that was sort of a summing up of everything that they had learned and what it meant for conservation. And in this paper, they say some really striking things. They say, for example, 20% of the flora of coastal Ecuador is endemic to that area. It doesn't occur anywhere else on Earth. And more than 90% of the forest in coastal Ecuador has been destroyed. This was 1991. Even then, more than 90% of the forest was gone. In the same paper, they also talk about those same patterns of endemism and extinction risk, habitat destruction at much smaller scales. And they really highlight one of their flora sites, which is Centinela Ridge. Now, Centinela is interesting because it's isolated mountain range right at the base of the Andes. So the Andes go all the way down to the lowlands, down to 200 meters, head towards the coast, but all of a sudden they come back up again. They come back up in a little mountain range that gets up to about 1,000 meters. And Gentry and Dodson were fascinated by this place. It had sort of a cloud forest climate to it, in contrast to the hot lowlands all around it. And they found just incredible stuff on this ridge. And in the paper, they say that they found 90 plant species at Centinela that they never found anywhere else in coastal Ecuador in their 20 years of looking. And the reason that this sentence in the paper is in the past tense is because they go on to say, and as we were preparing this paper, the last forests on Centinela were cut down. They're gone. And so these 90 plant species weren't just endemic, they're now extinct. And this paper hit the community like a bombshell, the scientific community, the conservation community. It's become a really foundational paper in tropical conservation. It's been cited 500 times. It generated a new term in biological sciences, Centinellan extinctions. And after it was published, a couple of things happened that even increased its impact even more. The year after it was published, another really prominent scientist, E.O. Wilson, retold the story of Centinela in his book, Diversity of Life. And what E.O. Wilson was interested in was that this story had implications globally. If every little mountaintop in the tropical region has 90 plant species that only occur there, many of them without names, then the scale of plant extinctions globally is way, way, way higher than we were thinking. It's worth noting that 1992 was also sort of a watershed moment for rainforests around the world. People were getting more and more interested in rainforest conservation. It was the year of the Rio Earth Summit. And so Centinela became sort of a poster child for rainforest conservation. This incredibly compelling, tragic, beautiful story of this incredibly diverse, special flora that had disappeared in a moment. And that story's impact grew even more the next year when Gentry was killed in a plane accident as he was doing conservation work in Western Ecuador. And all of this story about Centinela and about the loss was just irresistible for me as a young college student. 1993 was the year that I graduated, and it just tore me up to think that there were these tiny little bits of the tropics all through the rainforest where these creatures were making their homes and they were disappearing without even being recognized by us, without even being acknowledged by us, without even being named by us. In 1994, I was in Western Ecuador collecting plants. That's how much this story affected me. I had gone down to Ecuador with a group of people my age from around the world and from around Ecuador. And we weren't going to Centinela. There was no point in going to Centinela. Gentry had told us that the forests in Centinela were gone. And so we were doing what he and Dodson had suggested: go to the other places that are still standing, document them, try and protect them. So that's what we were doing. And as we were collecting plants through Western Ecuador, occasionally we'd come across a plant species that Gentry and Dodson had said was endemic to Centinela. And we'd sort of go, huh, that's weird, they got that one wrong. That's definitely not endemic, and thank goodness it's not extinct. We weren't really focused on Centinela that specifically. We were really interested in endemic species in a broader sense. Ecuador is about the size of Colorado, and it's got thousands of plant species that occur nowhere else on Earth. And so towards the end of the 90s, I co-led a group that got together dozens of botanists to try and figure out everything that we knew about these endemic species in Ecuador. Where they occurred, where they had last been seen, how long ago they had been seen, whether they had been seen in protected areas, what their IUCN threat status might be. And that book came out in 2000, and here's what we found. More than 4,000 endemic plants in Ecuador, more than a third of them known from one place, one locality. And 3/4 of them classified as globally threatened. When we were writing the introduction of this book, we wanted to write a section about sort of hotspots of endemism in Ecuador. What are the places in Ecuador that have a ton of endemic plants? And we generated a list from the database, and Centinela wasn't on the list. And I was like, okay, we made a mistake, go back, we'll do it again. Still not on the list. In that book, when we checked and rechecked, there were only 5 species that we could find that were endemic to Centinela that had never been collected anywhere else. But that was weird. We thought, well, Dodson and Gentry said that a lot of these things were undescribed, so maybe they just haven't come through the pipeline yet. All the endemics we were dealing with in the 2000 book were named, so let's give it some time. About 10 years later, we did a second edition of the endemics book. And the result here was 3. We found 3 plant species that looked like they had only ever been collected in Centinela. So how to think about this result? On the one hand, it's sort of easy to say, well, okay, they got that one wrong. Centinela isn't really special for microendemism. Let's move on. Let's work on other places. On the other hand, that approach sort of bugged me. And one of the reasons it bugged me is because Dodson and Gentry were so respected that when their paper came out, it was treated as sort of a report rather than as a hypothesis. And rereading the paper made it clear that it was a hypothesis. They were confident about the hypothesis, but they weren't sure about it. And because of their stature, we hadn't tested the hypothesis. And this is not a test of the hypothesis. That number 90 and that number 3 were arrived at totally independently, right? So we didn't arrive at the number 3 by looking at the 90 and crossing out 87 of them and arriving at 3. In fact, this 3 number includes a plant species that wasn't even discovered when Dodson and Gentry wrote their paper. And so we started thinking, well, what if we treat this hypothesis with the respect it deserves and test it? What would that look like? And about this time at the museum, a grad student walked into my office and said, I'm doing a thesis at UIC on systematics, but I'm really interested in conservation too. Is there any side project that we could work on while I'm doing my thesis that's focused more on conservation? Dawson, who went on to become a postdoc here, is now a postdoc at Harvard University. And we decided, yeah, let's test this theory of microendemism in the Centinela flora. And we recruited Ken Feely at University of Miami to work on this with us. We were all fired up when we hit roadblocks, multiple roadblocks. Looking at the paper, we were like, okay, the first thing we need is that list of 90 species. No list of 90 species. There's no appendix, there's no supplemental data. Never was a list of the 90 species. There are a few mentioned in the paper, not 90. Okay, well, that's no problem. We'll just go to, herbaria databases because we'll look at the vouchers. No voucher information either in the paper. So not really clear how to generate that list of 90 species. we're like, fine, we'll just go to GBIF, and you know that tool on GBIF, you just draw like a little polygon. This is the area we're interested in. We'll generate some data. So there's no map of the study area in the 91 paper either. And all the papers that mention Centinela, no map. And so we said, okay, that's no big deal, because specimen labels have coordinates on them, right? That's easy. Well, it was the 70s and the 80s. And so, yeah, they do have coordinates on them, but it was before GPS. And so these are coordinates sort of taken off of old topo maps under candlelight. So when you map them on a GIS, they're just all over the place. So we needed help. There's a lot of data on Centinela up in the herbarium, along with the 2.5 million plant specimens up there. But most of the information about Centinela is at Missouri Botanic Garden, where Gentry worked, and at Selby Botanic Garden, where Dodson worked. And so we went down and talked to a long-term colleague of ours at Missouri, and she said, you know, there's an archive here of Gentry stuff. I'm going to look through the archive and see if you left anything on Centinela. And she came up with the piece of the puzzle that allowed us to actually test the hypothesis. Here's a typewritten species list from 1983 titled Centinela flora. It's got a list of species, morphospecies. It's got a list of sites. So anything that has a C in it means it's from Centinela. If it only has a C, they only found it at Centinela. And it's got vouchers. Finally, we can do this work. And so Dawson and Ken and I downloaded a bunch of data from GBIF, every plant ever collected in Ecuador, in Colombia, and tried to start reconstructing that list of 90 species that Dawson and Gentry had reason to believe was endemic to Centinela. And after some long years of work, here's what we got. 4 species. And this is sort of a grab bag of species. These are the 4 species that were putative endemics at that time. There's all kinds of stuff. There are orchids and Rutaceae treelets and leguminous trees and terrestrial herbs and Gesneriaceae. This one's worth special mention because of the striking name. So discovered in the 70s, described in 2000, the taxonomist had seen the 1991 paper, couldn't find any other specimens from anywhere else, and decided this is a name that makes sense. And of course, that's not how the system works, but that is the plant named after its own extinction. So at the same time that we were working on this data set, we were also trying to build an alternative hypothesis for what had happened at Centinela. And it became pretty clear that what had happened was that the idea of microendemism had been a sort of a mirage caused by not enough sampling. And so this graph shows the proportion of species of plants known from Centinela that were also known from other places over time. And so if you look at this side of the axis, this is 2020. By then, pretty much everything known from Centinela had been found elsewhere. But when Gentry and Dodson wrote their paper here, you could see 90% of the flora had been found elsewhere, 10% appeared to be endemic. And so the sort of obvious alternative hypothesis for what had happened was that they just didn't have enough information. Coastal Ecuador and coastal Colombia just hadn't been collected enough for the real pattern to emerge. And as we're running these analyses, we're also testing some of the mechanisms that they had mentioned that they thought were really driving endemism at Centinela. For example, when we looked at where these species were being found elsewhere in Ecuador and Colombia, we wondered, are they all being found at sort of 1,000 meters elevation in cloud forest conditions? Is there something special about those climatological conditions? The answer very clearly, no. These things were being found everywhere. Dry forest, wet forest, high forest, low forest, all over the map. And same pattern geologically. And so here we felt like, okay, we've sort of closed this story. We have not finding evidence for the original hypothesis. We have strong evidence for the new hypothesis. We're done. We can close this story. Sentinella is not an important site of microendemism. And we can go ahead and write a paper saying that. But there are a couple of things bugging us about that as well that kept us from submitting that paper. One of them is that 4 species isn't 90 species, but 4 species isn't 0 species either, right? Remember that this is a mountain range the size of O'Hare. And if every O'Hare-sized patch of mountains in the tropics has 4 plant species that occur nowhere else on Earth, we still have a big problem as conservationists. What do? Set up a park on every one of those, visit everyone and collect those plants and take them to botanic gardens? And so we couldn't really write a paper saying, we're done. We're not done. The other thing that was holding us back was that none of us had ever been to Sentinella. And so the idea of writing sort of the definitive paper on Sentinella without ever having gone there didn't make sense. We were able to get some funding to go down to Sentinella in November of 2021. And we went down very much with the idea of closing this chapter. Okay, we'll go down. We're going to look at some sites in the main body of the Andes next to Sentinella. We're going to find some of these 4 species that are supposedly endemic to Sentinella that we don't really believe are. We can close that chapter. I'm going to say we. This was a big expedition with about 10 different botanists from 4 Ecuadorian universities. We also worked with the Ecuadorian Institute of Biodiversity. And we had 3 trucks. We sort of explored all over this mountain range, walked around looking for forest. That was our first question. Was there any forest at Sentinella? Here's a picture of Sentinella, and this is sort of a typical landscape, what you see when you're walking around that little mountain range. And it's not good news for forests or for rare plants. From the left, you've got balsa plantations. Going to the right, you've got banana plantations. On the far right, you've got cacao plantations. In the background, you have cattle pasture. And maybe if you squint, and this is what we were doing, riding around these bumpy roads, squinting into the distance, maybe if you squint, you can see some little patches of remnant forest in the areas that were too steep to cut or along creeks. And so for 2 days in Sentinella and 1 day on the main body of the Andes near Sentinella, we walked around looking for forest, walking into those patches, seeing what we could find. And the wonderful news was that 30 years after we had believed that these forests were gone, we found that they weren't. There were lots of little patches of forest still standing. Of course, for the vertebrate biologists in the room, these aren't very interesting. They're largely biological deserts. They're so small, many of them smaller than an acre, that the vertebrates have long since disappeared. But for a plant biologist, all our stuff is still there. The sensation of walking into one of these forests, even if you can hear cows mooing and chainsaws running, it's the same sensation as walking into one of these remote sites we work in the Amazon. Just gorgeous, jewel-like cloud forests, wonderful. Here's an example of the work that we did. This is the first day of field work. This is a drone shot, so looking straight down on the first patch of forest that we visited. We parked the truck here and walked in. And to give you an idea of scale, walking from here to there took about a minute. This is maybe an acre of forest. It's on a hilltop. It's surrounded on all sides by cattle pasture. we walked into this forest, we're immediately blown away by the wonderful plants that we found there. And started collecting. All of us were collectors. We started collecting and climbing trees and throwing things in the bag. I was especially interested in looking for Gastranthus extinctus. I thought it might well still be there. And so I walked all over this hilltop for about an hour looking for it. I didn't see Gastranthus extinctus. I didn't see any Gesneriaceae at all. So after about an hour, I met up with the colleague from Guayaquil and said, the thing's not anywhere. And he said, dude, of course it's not anywhere. Those things like water, they're not going to be up here on a hilltop. You want to find that plant, go find some water. And so I looked down the hill, and down here is a little creek with a tiny little fringe of forest along it. And so I made my way through the cattle pasture to that forest. And all we really had to go with in this search was a black and white line drawing from the description of Gastranthus extinctus. And down in this tiny strip of forest along this creek, and here the forest is maybe as wide as this room, there was this giant, gorgeous orange flower. Luckily, Gastranthus extinctus is really distinctive morphologically, and so it was quite quickly clear that this is what we had found. These hairs are really diagnostic. The specialists confirmed it from photos the same day. And so this was the second big discovery on the first day in Sentinel. Yes, they're forests, and yes, they still have some really wonderful plants in them. At the same time that we were collecting Gastranthus extinctus, our colleagues were a few kilometers away doing the same thing. They found it in the first couple hours of fieldwork as well. This is a map of the Centinela mountain range. Over here is the main body of the Andes. Everything that's gray is under 500 meters, and so lowlands. And so you see that Andes come down to the lowlands, come across this low area, and then come back up in these three sky islands that have cloud forest on them. And so the site I just showed you the drone image of is 2. The colleagues at the same time were finding it at 3. And over the next day, we found it at 4 as well. The only place we looked for it and didn't find it was here. 1 is where we think Dodson and Gentry discovered it in the 70s. And so this thing was really not hard to find. Almost everywhere we looked for it. And the last day we went to 5, which was the site on the main body of the Andes. And it was there as well, growing next to this spectacular waterfall. And so suddenly it's clear that Gastranthus extinctus was neither extinctus nor endemicus to Centinela. At this site in the main body of the Andes, in the first hour of field work, we collected one of those other 4 species that we had thought might still be endemic to Centinela, the tree and the Fabaceae. And so with 2 hours of targeted field work, we managed to cross 2 of these putative endemics off the list. And at this point, we thought, okay, we're really done now. Let me pause just for a second and talk about Gastranthus extinctus. The day that we photographed it, found it and photographed it for the first time, we went back to our base camp and one of us uploaded it to iNaturalist. And that person was looking at iNaturalist and all of a sudden called the rest of the team over and said, guys, there's 3 records of this thing already in iNaturalist. So we all ran to look at this plant, and sure enough, there's the plant that we've been looking at. And it had been recorded 2 years before we recorded it. It wasn't identified as Gastranthus extinctus. And there was something really curious about the records. There are 3 different records by 3 different users, 3 different sites, all on the same day, and 2 of them showing the same plant. And so we wrote to the users, tried to figure out this mystery. Where was this population of Gastranthus extinctus? And turns out it was also in the main body of the Andes. And so these iNaturalist users, 3 engineering students from Ecuador's military university, had gone to an ecotourism site, photographed this plant, and 2 years before we figured out that this thing was neither extinct nor endemic, they had gotten a record showing exactly the same thing. So like I said, at this point, we think, okay, we're kind of done. We have 88 reasons to believe that these things, even though we haven't found them anywhere else, aren't endemic to Sentinella. We will find them somewhere else at some point. We had 88 reasons to think there's not that much special about Sentinella. It's not that interesting anymore. It's not a site of microendemism, a really special flora. And the awkward thing about that feeling was that at the same time that we had all this data showing that the story was done, we were totally falling in love with these forests. So check this out. One reason is because they're just spectacular. There's Gastranthus extinctus growing on these rock walls. This is one of the sites that's on the main bodies of the Andes. Smaller than Grant Park. Chock full of endemic and lovely threatened plant species. It's just spectacular. At the same time, like I said, we were collectors, and so we were collecting a ton in all these places that we were visiting. And that was cool because no one had collected there for almost 30 years. Here's the pattern of plant collections in Sentinel. It starts in the 70s when Gentry and Dodson are collecting. The paper gets published. People stop going. No collections for like 30 years. And the amazing things when we restarted the collections in 2021, same sensation that Gentry and Dodson described back when they were collecting in the 70s and 80s. We were finding incredible stuff. So since 2021, 2 new species of plants have been described. This Schweiler tree, this orchid, both described this year. 4 other species not known to science were found in a subsequent expedition to Sentinella in the space of a day and a half. And so again, it was like kind of a conflicted feeling. On the one hand, we're about to publish this paper saying, oh, not such a big deal. On the other hand, we're finding this incredible stuff that Gentry and Dodson had found. And yeah, we had a lot of reason to believe that these undescribed species are not endemic to Sentinella. But maybe there's a different hypothesis. Why is this place turning up so many special plants? More than 50 globally threatened plants on the list for Sentinella now. And so at the same time that we published the paper about the rediscovery of Gastranthus extinctus, we also put out a website describing conservation opportunities for Sentinella. And the main message of the website was, guys, there's still forests there. This is incredible. 30 years later, there's still an opportunity to save a little bit of forest on Sentinella. And we try to be specific about it. So there's a page here on the discoveries, on news, on photos and maps, but there's a page also on opportunities. So if you're a government official, here's what we think the conservation opportunities are. If you're a student or you're working on iNaturalist, here's what some conservation opportunities are. And it's been really wonderful to see some of these opportunities start to bear fruit. I want to highlight a few things that are ongoing and that have taken this story of Centinela in a brand new direction. So one of the opportunities we saw was for ex situ conservation, right? If we can't protect the last of these forests, then maybe we can preserve some living populations of the plant species that are so special there. And a few months ago, Dr. Zoe Diaz-Martin at Chicago Botanic Garden got a grant from Walder Foundation that is going to allow us to do this for Gastranthus extinctus. The Field Museum is going to collect wild populations of the plant, and in collaboration with this botanic garden, 10-15 kilometers north of Centinela in Santo Domingo, Zoe is going to set up captive populations of Gastranthus, do population genetics, share material with other botanic gardens around the world, and guarantee that this plant extinctus never goes extinct. Of course, we're interested in preserving some of these forest fragments that we found as well. Like I said, most of them are tiny. A couple of them are big, but big in Western Ecuador is a relative term, right? The biggest fragments that we found were maybe 50 hectares, 125 acres. That's it. That's all that's left. And so it's a real challenge for conservation, but it's a really important one. If you look at a map of existing protected areas in Ecuador right now, there's a big gap in the part of coastal Ecuador where Centinela is. No parks. On the right is a map of private reserves run by an Ecuadorian NGO that sort of specializes on this kind of thing, protecting the last fragments of interesting habitat. And you can see there's a big gap there as well. And so we've been talking to both institutions, trying to figure out what the best opportunities are for preserving some of these fragments. They're all privately owned. It's all private land. We've talked to a bunch of landowners, and maybe the opportunity that's best developed at this point is this site that we visited with those spectacular waterfalls. The owner runs it as an ecotourism operation, is very interested in having it declared as an official private protected area, and has run into some roadblocks from the government for doing that. Hasn't succeeded in declaring a private conservation area. And so we've been talking with government officials and with him, trying to figure out how to clear away those barriers to protect this fragment of forest. Another thing we've been working on for a few years now, the Action Center has been collaborating with Yale to make sure that these thousands of endemic species in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru are visible to conservationists, right? There's so many of these species out there, and so many of them are visible to people like us, right? To museum folk, to taxonomists who describe them. And for the people who are out there in the field, managing parks, managing reserves, managing watersheds, sometimes this information just isn't there. They don't know there's a lizard species here that occurs nowhere else on Earth. But we wanted to change that. We wanted to build a site together with Map of Life that would allow land managers to click on their protected area and get quick information from global databases about what we think or know is in those areas and which of those species are probably a especially interesting priority for conservation. So here's an example. This is a park in Ecuador that has multiple vertebrate species known from nowhere else on Earth. I promised I would go back to Al Gentry, and I do want to talk a little bit about his legacy and the legacy of all of the female scientists who contributed to clearing up this really complicated, long, 30-year-long mystery. In honor of Women's History Month, I want to highlight contributions that women made to this book especially. This is the most recent version of the Red Book of Endemic Plant Species of Ecuador. Huge collaborative effort, more than 80 authors, more than a third of whom are women. These are plant collectors, these are taxonomists, these are students, these are conservationists who provided all the building blocks that made it clear what we need to do to protect these species. The editor-in-chief of this book, Susana Leon, is a director of the herbarium at the Catholic University in Ecuador. Lucia Kawasaki, our very own incredible taxonomist up in botany, did the Myrtaceae part of this book. He recently completed the treatment of Myrtaceae for flora of Ecuador, 131 species of myrtles in Ecuador. Lucia is a legendary plant taxonomist. This is Gladys Benavides. Gladys participated in these two red books, and now, by coincidence, is working in the government, the state government of the province where that ecotourism operation with the waterfalls is located. She knows the owner. She's been working with the owner to figure out how to make that, how to preserve that forest over the long term. And so she's been super helpful as we think about how to make those opportunities reality. And finally, I want to celebrate Lorena Endara and Nora Oleas. Lorena and Nora were undergraduates when the first Red Book was being written. I helped supervise their undergraduate theses at the Catholic University in Quito. And both of them went on to do PhDs in botany. Both are now botany professors training the next generation. And so there's a really big, strong, vigorous network of female botanists working in Ecuador. And there's also big, strong structural barriers preventing full participation of those scientists even today. And so I invite you to visit the REMC page, follow them on Twitter to get a better idea of what those challenges are and what opportunities for getting over them we can help with. I want to end by saying something for the students in the audience or for the younger scientists in the audience. Like I said at the beginning of this talk, this 1991 paper was kind of the paper that got me started. It really fired me up. It energized me. It made me do what I do today. And so I want you to think about the paper that got you started, that's gotten you excited. Maybe it was last week, maybe it was last year. That paper that you just think, this is so amazing. I have to do this the rest of my life. I want to remind you that you're going to be carrying that paper around with you in a figurative sense in your back pocket for the rest of your career. In a figurative sense, it's going to get torn, it's going to get dog-eared, it's going to get coffee spilled on it and all this stuff. And I want to remind you that that's okay. It's really important that those papers that started us off energize us, inspire us, push us to do what we do. And at the same time, it's really important to ask hard questions about those papers, to hold their feet to the fire, to visit and revisit those questions. Because after all, we are going to have 10, 20, 30 years worth of data, worth of new scientific tools, worth of scientific insights that our heroes didn't have. It's not about criticizing the people who came before us or pointing out their errors. It's the opposite. It's about celebrating these discoveries that they handed down to us. I want to remind you that we celebrate Al Gentry every year in the Parker Gentry Award celebration. It's exactly it's the 25th of April. About a month from now, you're all invited to the award celebration, and you can learn more about the award at this website here. I'm alone up here on the stage, but I'm talking on behalf of the whole Sentinella team, this group that came together to revisit Sentinella and data from Sentinella. And here I really want to highlight Dawson. As I said, Dawson started out as a grad student, and he's ended up as the leader of this effort. He's leading the conservation, he's leading the science. It's been so rewarding to see him evolve into just a fantastic scientist and fantastic conservationist. I want to thank all the people in Ecuador, all the institutions in Ecuador that made this work possible. And I want to thank everyone here in Chicago, without whom we wouldn't have been able to do any of this work. I'm happy to take questions. Thanks a lot.
All right, do we have any questions?
Thanks, Nigel. That was really great. So I was just wondering, like, why do you think it is that Gentry and Dodson were so quick to declare Sentinella as being completely deforested when it wasn't?
Good question. I think there are some different answers to that. One, maybe access, and maybe that they didn't have that map that I showed of Sentinella. They didn't have that. They had old topo maps. They didn't have the roads that we had to access the entire mountain chain. They didn't have satellite imagery to sort of guide them to the larger fragments. And so there's a sort of methods answer to that question about resources. I think there's a stylistic answer to that question as well. The paper on the one hand comes out and says, this place is totally gone. If you read carefully, you don't have to read between the lines. It says, there's some little patches of forest left. And so, again, a style of scientific writing, a style of science that was a little bit having it both ways. And what won out was the big story. It's all gone. This is exciting. It's tragic. And again, when we went back and read it, what we saw was a hypothesis rather than this assertion.
Question. There was a moment when you said that you wondered if there were characteristics about those endemics that was related to the cloud forest across their range. And I'm wondering if you could say more about what those were, if you did feel like those stood out. And then is that something being used to also drive conservation opportunities, like just identifying spaces without necessarily having the data you guys have collected on the actual species?
Good questions, both of them. One thing that we were interested in looking at was a dispersal mechanism, right? Because you might, if all of these things were orchids, for example, you might think, okay, maybe there's something going on with that's preventing these things from dispersing. And we didn't find that at all. It's that list of 90 is sort of a random sample across families and habits and dispersal mechanisms. We are really interested in where these plant species can be preserved with the largest bang for our buck, where they're congregating, and that is not clear to us yet. There's still very, very strong sampling bias that we see even today. That western slope of the Andes is very poorly collected. The places that are collected are along roads that come down the Andes. And so, yeah, lots and lots of questions still to answer.
Thanks, Nigel. I have a question regarding ecology, I guess, because you said there are no more mammals there, or not big mammals, and I guess also not big birds. But if I understood right, the plant composition hasn't changed that much in those small patches. So I guess there is an interesting ecological question about what was the connection between those animals that are not there anymore, but yet the composition is still the same or similar. So I was just wondering if anybody's doing that kind of research now, or if that question is being addressed somehow.
I don't think so. And that part of the talk was a little bit hand wavy, to be honest. We didn't do large vertebrate surveys. The assumption is that in such a degraded habitat, a lot of that diversity has been lost. And we also don't have really good data about what these plant communities look like as far as community structure goes 30 years ago. We have species lists, but we don't really know what was common, what was rare, how those things have changed. What we do know is that within these tiny fragments, we're finding a lot of really high plant diversity. And even within the cattle pastures, there's really high tree diversity. As you saw in some of the pictures, a lot of trees from the original forest were left when the pasture was cut down. And so there's a really significant proportion of the original forest standing in places that are entirely degraded. And so for the next several decades, that will continue to be the case for plants.
I think Nigel, beautiful talk as always. It was an emotional roller coaster for me. Centinela reminds me a lot of lots of places that we see in Western Ecuador or other places in the Americas. And I think you're very right to point out that there's lots of gaps in our knowledge of it. One thing that I'm curious about looking at, and I've read that same paper and had the same thought about Gentry saying there's no forest left when I read it. Many places in Ecuador are losing forest at an alarming rate. Not all places, there's some places see regeneration, although what that means biologically is unclear. Have you folks looked at satellite data going back? We do have data that goes back to 1993 or so to get a sense of what this forest looked like in the time of Al, and maybe how it's changed and what its trajectory looks like moving forward.
We haven't, and that would be a great new addition to the team. We don't have someone who works with satellite imagery. We've looked at forest cover maps and found them less useful than we wanted them to be because there's so much plantation forest in this region now. There's a forest being lost. There was forest being cut as we were visiting, mostly for balsa plantations. And so, yeah, it would be a great addition to the team to have someone to really look at the dynamics and identify these remaining fragments from space.
Great, thanks.
All right, we do have a question from the Zoom. This is from Anonymous. Given that our knowledge is so full of false negatives, shouldn't we pay less attention to species presences? On what other things can we focus in practice to get a better picture of reality?
Great question. And yes, I think we should bite our tongues every time that we are tempted to say, this place is so different, it's so special, it's so, this species is only here. We know we've have a long history of getting those statements wrong in the tropics. One aspect of this work that I feel is incredibly incomplete, and that touches on some of these sampling questions as well, is, remember we were talking about E.O. Wilson's projections of the news from Sentinel and saying, if this is happening everywhere, what are the implications for conservation? Well, one step we haven't taken is to sort of redo that thought experiment now. If there are no Sentinellas, what does that mean for conservation? If everything is everywhere and there aren't really narrowly endemic species, what does that mean for conservation? And so I can't at all say in this talk, because Sentinel is not a hotspot of microendemism, therefore there are none in the Andes. There's still many, many cases of particular valleys and ridges that are well known to have lots of plant species never found anywhere else. My dream is that there be an army of students out there trying to gather more data and figure out these questions so that we can prevent extinction among those species.
Nigel, that was beautiful. What do you think the conservation strategy should be? Sort of building on what you just said, that maybe if there isn't microendemism, what if you could draw a map right now of these are my highest conservation priorities in Western Ecuador? Do you feel like it's what's that? Conserve it all? Or strategy beyond that? How are you seeing it?
I feel like that I'm going to give you an answer, and I'm not convinced it's the right answer, but something that I've been working on a lot is really trying to answer these questions about sampling bias and where things are with a focus on protected areas. We really don't know very well what our protected areas are protecting when it comes to these globally rare, endemic, threatened species. It's a weird situation, right? We spend a lot of time protecting forests. We're making a lot of progress protecting forests. And lots of those forests are still black boxes. And so there's some basic accounting to know, like, do we need to protect this fragment in Centinela? Or are these things in that park that I showed you in the biodiversity dashboards website? Is all that stuff up in the park? In which case, let's focus on the park and not Centinela. And so that's something that I'm really interested in figuring out. In the meantime, let's save some of these small fragments and get some of the rarest plants into botanic gardens.
Maybe one last question.
So, Al's practice, as I recall it, he was in the habit of running transects, and he would collect along the transects. So was there any, did he have any even rough maps of where these transects were in these areas that are in his, in with his papers in St. Louis?
Yes, there's a 10-hectare plot that was done at Centinela. We can't figure out where it was done. On that map that we have some ideas of where it might have been. It looks like that particular area where Dodson, we think Dodson and Gentry were, was entirely destroyed. There isn't forest there anymore. And so we think that's probably the case. One really interesting thing about this landscape is that the names are all screwy. So when we walked around and drove around this area, we talked to lots of people who live there, and we asked, like, where's Centinela? What does Centinela mean to you? What does that name mean to you? What's the name of this mountain? What's the name of that mountain range? And the answer from everyone we talked to was Centinela, never heard of it. There's a little town over there called Centinela. That's the only Centinela we know. But these mountains, they're not called Centinela. There's no ridge called Centinela. There's no hilltop called Centinela. The plant specimen labels also mention the Gila Mountains as a name for this general area. No one had ever heard of that. We couldn't find a single person living in this area that ever heard that name as well. Well, what is the name? What's this stretch of mountains called? We don't have a name for it. So yeah, some basic questions still to be answered about this region.
All right, thank you so much, Nigel.
Thanks again, everyone.